The Pope's army was crushed, the fearsome Normans triumphant. The charge of Richard of Aversa's Norman cavalry had scattered the Pope's Italian infantry troops. The Pope's Swabian swordsmen, famed for their prowess, had been cut down by knights under the command of the brothers Humphrey and Robert of Hautvilles. The Normans had won the field, and now they marched right up to the walls of the fortress from which the Pope had observed the battle. The Pope, Leo IX, had run out of options. He had no choice but to go out and meet these fierce men of the north who had caused such turmoil recently in southern Italy. What awaited the Pope once he surrendered? Captivity, or worse? In truth, the Pope's face-to-face meeting with these Normans would greatly surprise him and alter the history of European Christendom.
Brothers all around as I kneel, and the oath is sworn.
In the early 11th century, southern Italy was a complicated and tumultuous region. Portions belonged to the Byzantine Empire, while Lombard princes ruled other areas. Both started using Norman adventurers as mercenaries. However, the Normans, famously opportunistic, soon took advantage of southern Italian turmoil. By the mid-11th century, Normans had carved out portions of the peninsula for their own rule. Most notably, the Hautvilles clan, under William Ironarm, had taken control of the county of Apulia. On his election in 1049, Pope Leo IX immediately had to confront the growth of Norman power. Complaints were flooding into Rome that the Normans were lawless, rapacious, and subjected the people to plunder and exactions. The Byzantine authorities and territorial Lombard princes also objected to the Normans, whom they regarded as brigands with no legitimate claim to power. First, Leo tried dialogue, but he quickly learned that promises from Norman leadership were often unreliable. Norman lords themselves frequently could not stop their freebooting cousins from terrorizing the countryside. The Pope gave up negotiating and opted for a military solution. In the early 1050s, Leo began organizing an anti-Norman coalition. He requested troops from the Holy Roman Emperor, but received none. However, the Pope's chancellor, the hard-nosed Frederick of Lorraine, was able to assemble 700 Swabian infantrymen. Also, the Pope secured a large number of Italian contingents, especially from the Lombard states. Finally, the Byzantine Empire promised to send a force to join the papal campaign. The Normans were prone to quarreling among themselves, but they were quite efficient at putting aside personal differences when they recognized an existential threat. This clearly was one of those times, and the various Norman factions of southern Italy began scrambling to enlist any knight who could sit on a horse. Robert Guiscard assembled his men in Calabria. His older brother, Humphrey of Hauteville, Count of Calabria, the most prestigious Norman lord during this period, led the vanguard. Richard of Aversa, who realized that the outcome of this campaign could decide the fate of the Normans in Italy, also placed his men under Count Humphrey's leadership. In 1053, as the papal army marched south, the Normans moved quickly to meet the threat. Above all, they were determined to prevent the Pope's men from linking up with the Byzantines. In this, the Normans were successful, but at a price. The Norman army that intercepted the papal forces near Civitate was exhausted after weeks of hard marching in the summer heat. To make matters worse, the locals, who despised the Normans as oppressors, hid the area's food supplies, and so the Normans went hungry. The night before the battle, they were forced to eat grain fresh from the fields, dried before their fires to make it semi-edible. Initially, the Normans asked for dialogue. They promised future loyalty and obedience to Leo IX, but the leaders of the papal army flatly rejected such offers. The Swabians mocked the Normans as poor warriors and gave them an ultimatum: abandon all territories they'd conquered in Italy or face destruction in battle. The Normans disliked both options. They'd gotten a good look at the Pope's allies, and they were convinced that they could win. Early the next morning, the battle began. Richard of Aversa led a detachment of cavalry against the Italians on the left. Before the might of Richard's charge, the Italians broke and fled almost at once. This situation could have devolved into a chaotic pursuit, but Richard and his knights regrouped and later joined with the main Norman army. Meanwhile, the Swabians, with their iron-solid formation, had moved against the Norman center. Humphrey of Hautvilles' knights made repeated charges against the Swabians. At a critical moment, Robert Guiscard brought his knights from the left wing into the center, and this thrust broke the Swabian formation. The Swabians showed incredible bravery, fighting to the very last man. The battle had been brutal and harrowing, but Norman cohesiveness had prevailed. The ability of the Normans to coordinate various contingents, to move quickly and hit hard where it was needed, and then to regroup and carry on as a unified whole. This is what delivered victory. Pope Leo must have been in shock. Not only had his army been defeated, it had been annihilated. Now, he was at the mercy of the Norman army at his gates. Resigning himself to the situation, the Pope emerged from the fortress with his entourage, resplendent in the finest robes and vestments of the papal office. But the Normans did not meet the Pope as gloating conquerors, for their ruthlessness was matched only by their piety. They greeted the Pope as their spiritual father, submitting themselves before him. They vowed their loyalty to the Church and asked Pope Leo to forgive their sins. The Pope was astonished, but as we now know, he should not have been. For the Normans were not only sincere in their Christian faith, they also recognized the value of the Pope's spiritual leadership. Pope Leo could grant the Normans what the mere brute conquest of their swords could not: legitimacy to their rule in Italy. Despite this elaborate display of submission before papal power, it was clear that the Normans were going to insist that the Pope grant them certain concessions. The Norman army remained encamped outside of Benevento, while their leaders came to terms with the Pope. The Normans acknowledged the Pope's spiritual authority and recognized him as overlord of the Italian lands they'd conquered. In return, the Pope invested the Normans as the lawful rulers of their new domains. Pope Leo lived only another year, but the outcome of the Battle of Civitate would live on, and would in fact loom large in the coming centuries. Future popes would forge strong bonds with the Normans. Indeed, the Normans of southern Italy would prove to be great champions of the Church, in conjunction with it, coming to realize some of their greatest religious, political, and architectural aspirations. Despite the tumult of their early conquests, the Normans of Italy would ultimately create one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms of the medieval world.
And the sword that once carved my path to hell will guard the pilgrim's way.
If you like this video, check out my novel of the Crusades, Why Does the Heathen Rage? Click the link below.